Affairs. The need to prevent the closure of Cuan Álainn Women's Refuge Centre, Dáil, Dublin 24. Deputy Sportmates, an opening statement. Deputy Seán Crowe.
Good morning, this is about the Respond Women's Refuge in Dáil. It's called Cuan Álainn. Minister, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the site. It's in an ideal site. It's near the hospital. It's near the Garda station. It's anonymous and surrounded by a supportive community. The difficulty is that Respond, the voluntary agency, say they cannot afford to fund the refuge for women and children fleeing domestic violence. And I suppose what's happened is that Respond has literally bankrolled the refuge in Dáil for the last 3.5 years without any financial support of the state. It caters for 9 families and has housed 71 women and 96 children for that 3.5 years at 350,000 per annum. Respond undertook to take this on for 3 years. And without this service, women and children will now or may have to return to that abusive, that potentially dangerous environment. So I suppose the question I'm asking here today is, I've heard that agencies, including TULSA, accept that Respond has identified a definite need to care for women and children in these circumstances. We know that there's a need for these type of refuges. I suppose the question we ask is, if this closes, where do the women go? We know, for instance, that if they go to the local hospital, the sexual assault unit, normally the Gardaí refer them then onto the refuge itself. The catchment area is a huge catchment area, but it's not just women from Dáil or the wider area. It could be women from different counties and so on, depending on the safety, and that's the clients move from different ones. It's doing its job. I would argue that it's working well. And if we face the possible closure of this, we're actually going backwards. I'd ask the Minister if this closes, what's going to replace it? I would argue that we need to be opening more of these women's refuges, not closing them. So, Minister, it's a matter of money. I raised this during the discussion on homelessness because it's part of that chain in relation to homelessness. If you leave the family home because of domestic violence, because of sexual assault, and we know the whole different, what eventually forces these women to leave the family home. And it's usually the women have to leave and the abusive partner stays behind. So it's the safety aspect of that. So, Minister, I'm asking you, what can you do in relation to this matter? It's not a huge amount of money. Your colleague, Minister Alan Kelly, said in relation to the homeless issue that it's not a matter of resources. And I'm glad to hear that. But this is part of that chain, because the next step, when you leave the home, it's homeless. The other added difficulty is if the guards have someone in the local hospital and they're after being attacked and after being abused, they will normally look for somewhere for that family to go. It's either hostel accommodation. We know in Dublin, if it's certainly at night time, that's full. Hotels, it's, again, we're into the same difficulty. So where do they go? Usually the guards will say, well, we put them up in the station. That's all okay for maybe an hour or two or a couple of hours, or, they're pushed overnight. So it's where did the families go? So if we take this huge important piece of infrastructure out of the system, what's to replace it? So I look forward eagerly to your reply, Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. And Dr. James Reilly. First thought.
And I'd like to thank Deputy Crowe for raising this issue, and I welcome the opportunity to clarify the position in relation to the funding of domestic violence services by TULSA, the Child and Family Agency. Indeed, I am aware of this, as Deputy Pat Rabbitte has raised this issue with me on a number of occasions. It's my understanding that the Cuan Álainn Centre was established independently of the state and opened in 2012. It is funded by Respond Housing Association. TUSA, the Child and Family Agency, allocates available funding for domestic violence to emergency refuge accommodation services and community-based domestic violence supports. It does not fund Cuan Álainn. I understand that the Cuan Álainn Centre provides second-stage accommodation for women and children who've experienced domestic violence and who may already have been in emergency accommodation. The facility does not operate as a frontline emergency domestic violence service. Rather, it provides a step-down or transitional accommodation to support transition into a permanent settled home. This can include survivors of domestic violence who are transitioning from emergency services to a new permanent home. Officials from my department and TUSLA recently met with Respond at the Housing Association's request to discuss the current situation in Cuan Álainn. Respond advised that it was not in a position to continue funding for the centre. The department sought additional information from Respond, including information in relation to the Housing Association's overall financial situation. The most recent information provided indicated that Respond, which is made up of 2 companies, was in good overall financial health. I hope that the matter can be satisfactorily resolved by allowing sufficient time for all avenues to be explored by the relevant parties. This will need to include discussion with other parties, including the Department of Environment, Community and Local Government, as it would appear that these families have pressing housing needs, understandably. In this regard, I hope that a meeting with Respond can be arranged shortly. TUSLA will continue to work closely with service providers to ensure that women and children fleeing domestic abuse receive all necessary emergency support. The position in respect of the Cuan Álainn service is being kept under close review.
Thank you, Minister. Seán Crowe.
I listened to what you're saying, Minister, in relation to this independent, set up independently. You're saying it's transitional services, but I suppose the question I'm asking is it needed? And I would argue, and I think anyone with half a brain would agree that it's certainly needed. My difficulty is that they're proposing to close this at the 18th of December, and as you know, Minister, the 25th of December, Christmas, huge pressure on families. And if you look at the stats probably over the years, this is a time when there's huge pressures coming on families, and a lot of domestic violence breaks out during that period. So I suppose you're saying that you're hoping that it can be satisfactorily resolved by allowing sufficient time for all avenues to be explored with the relevant which is grand. It's kicking the can down the road. But I suppose what I was hoping to hear from you here today was that there was going to be some mechanism, there was going to be some avenue of funding that would actually keep this vital service open. As I opened up by saying that it's in an ideal location, that it fits the criteria, whether it's secondary from emergency housing or it's part of that chain that you said, that it's the next step then is for actually housing. It's a vital part of what we need to be doing as a society. And if it's not being done by the state, it should be being done by the states and the local authorities and our society as a whole. We shouldn't be relying on voluntary housing organisations or religious organisations or so on for these vital services. But unfortunately, that's what we do. Whether it's in education or other areas, or those with special needs and all, we push the problem onto someone else. So, Minister, I don't know if there's anything positive you can actually say to the staff that work in this centre, or say to more importantly, to those who are actually using the centre. The big question now is, where do you put these families? Where do they go next? And I suppose the next thing is about the next tranche of families and children who are looking to try and get into the system. Where do they go if we don't have this vital piece of infrastructure there?
Thank you, Deputy. And Tara, reply.
I thank the Deputy. Obviously, our concern are for the families that reside there and that need this service. And clearly there is a need for the state to provide services of this nature and to do so in a planned and organised fashion. Now, it's very welcome that Respond as a housing agency built this independently without regard to state, and it's also very commendable that they have funded it. But I do think that we need to have a proper organised handover if they're going to cease to fund it. It is not as if this organisation is bereft of funds, or that they're overdrawn in the bank, or that their capital is expended and they're extended. That is not the case. They're entitled, and their board is quite entitled to make a decision that having set this up and having funded it, that they feel it's not possibly core to their work and that they'd like to cease funding it. But I do believe that there is an onus on them to sit down and talk to us about how that can be handed over in an orderly fashion, and to allow both my department and the Department of Environment to determine how best to continue the funding in relation to supporting women and families who have been the subject of domestic violence and domestic abuse, and also how to transition from the emergency situation, as Respond have done by providing this service, into a more permanent solution and a permanent home, which clearly involves the Department of Environment as well. So it's not my intention that this service should fall between two stools. I look forward to sitting down and meeting with them to determine an orderly transition put in place for the funding of this organisation. And I really don't think it's fair to the families concerned to have them looking at the 18th of December, the week before Christmas, with a threat of them having the roof over their heads removed.
We